Section 9 of Strangers at Lisconnel by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 9. One morning not long after Christmas, the widow, being bound on an errand down below, called in at the Patmans with a view to possible commissions. Meal was wanted, and while Tishy M'Crum stitched up a rent in the bag, Mrs. M'Gurk noticed where little Katy, who had been took bad wid a cold these 3 days, rustled uncomfortably among wisps of rushes and rags in an obscure corner. Fever made her bold and self-assertive, for she was wishing nothing less than that her daddy would get her an orange with yeller peel around it. Katy laid stress upon this point, like the one her mammy got her a long time ago, and daddy'd be a good daddy and get her another now, and she'd keep a bit for Bobby and Stevie and all of them. A big yeller orange. Katie's eyes blazed with excitement as she reiterated these extravagant desires. "She's got an uncommon fancy for one," said her daddy, looking wistfully from the child to his wife. "They have them down below," suggested the widow, "pence apiece." Mrs. Patman's hand was slipping toward her pocket. "If it was just for wunst," she had begun, when Tishy tweaked her sleeve viciously and interpolated a rapid whisper. "It won't be. There'll be no ind to it if you begin humourin' them." So the sentence was badly dislocated. "She'll do a deal better widout any such trash," Mrs. Patman concluded, and walked off to throw sods on the fire. Just then the widow became aware that old Joe Patman was grimacing at her from a corner fast by in a way that might have startled her had she not been familiar with such modes of beckoning. But when she obeyed his summons, what she saw did astound her outright, for Joe was stooping low over a leathern pouch which he had drawn from a wall cranny, and which seemed to contain marvellous depths of silver money, with here and there a golden gleam among it, as he warily stirred it up, circling a hurried forefinger. She had only the briefest glimpse ere he shoved back the pouch and thrust a sixpence into her hand, muttering, "Get her the orange, don't be lettin' on for your life." As she turned away with a reassuring nod, she perceived that Tishy M'Crum was standing unexpectedly near, and looking towards them over the top of the meal bag. Tishy was biting off a loose end of thread, which gave her a determined and ferocious expression, but whether she could have seen anything or not, the widow felt uncertain. She thought not. About 10 days after this, Mrs. M'Gurk was roused at a very early hour by thumping on her door. When she opened it, she found some difficulty in recognising her visitor, as the dawn had scarcely done more than dim a few stars far away in the east, which is an ineffective form of illumination. "Whither now, Joe Patman, is it yourself?" she said peeringly. "And what's brought you out at all afore you can see a step or a stim? Is the little girl took worse?" For Katie's illness still continued and had grown rather serious. "Sure no," said the old man. "Katie's just pretty middlin', but it's waitin' I've been the len'th of the mornin', till 'twould turn broad daylight, before I'd be disturbin' of you, ma'am, to tell you the quare sort of a joke they're after playin' on me down yonder." "Saints above, man, what talk have you of jokin' at this hour of the day or night?" said Mrs. M'Gurk, feeling the unseasonableness acutely as a bitter gust came swooping up the slope and indiscriminately ruffled the rime-dusted grass tufts and her own grizzled locks. "Och, be jabbers, it's a great joke they have agin me, whatever," said old Patman, who was shivering much, with cold partly, and partly perhaps with amusement. "You see, the way of it was, last night, no great while after we'd all gone asleep, I woke up suddint, like as if wid the creak of a door or somethin', but whatever it might be, 'twas slipped beyond me hearin' afore I'd got a hould of me senses rightly. So I listened a goodish bit, and somehow everythin' seemed unnatural quiet, till I heard Katty fidgetin', and I went over to see would she take a drink of water. The Lord presarve us and keep us, ma'am, if all the rest of them hadn't quit out of it they have, and left us cliver and clean." "Ah, now don't be romancin', ma'am," said the widow remonstrantly. "What in the name of the nation 'ud bewitch any people to go rovin' out of their house in the middle of the black night, wid the frost thick on the ground?" "Quit they are," said the old man. "Tom's gone, and the wife, and every man jack of them. They've took the couple of chickens I noticed Tishy killin' of yesterday. Begorra, I believe they've took Tib the cat, for ne'er a sign of it I see about the place, that would mostly be sittin' cocked up atop the dresser. Goodness guide us, sorra a soul there is in the house but the two of us, me and the child, and she's rael bad. It's a queer old joke." "It 'ud be a joke of a set of ravin' mad people," said the widow. "But the rest of it is," he went on, "do you mind, ma'am?" He looked round him suspiciously and lowered his voice. "The leather pouch you might have seen wid me the other day?" "Ooh," said Mrs. M'Gurk, "are they after takin' that on you? Sure, man, I thought you had it unbeknownst." "Aye, it's took," old Patman said, "but how she grabbed it I dunno. Unless I was thinkin' be any chance you mentioned somethin' about it?" "Divil a bit of me did," the widow averred with truth, which her hearer accepted. "And how much might you have had in it at all?" "Troth, I couldn't be tellin' you," he said. "I never thought to count it. 'Tis just for a pleasure to meself I keep it. This long while back I've put ne'er a penny in it, but when we used to be livin' up in Portnafoyle I'd slip in the odd shillin's now and agin, and sometimes I'd think 'twould be handy for buryin' me, and other times I'd think I'd give it to Tom as soon as I'd gathered a trifle more. Only some way the thought of partin' wid it 'ud seem to go agin me, and since poor Tom made a match with Martha M'Crum, 'tis worse agin me it goes." "'Tis that good for nought weasel of a slieveen Tishy's after conthrivin' it on me, I well know. And bad luck to her," quoth the old man, with a sudden spasm of resentment. "Tom 'ud never play such a trick. I mane it wasn't he invented the joke. He doesn't trouble himself wid much jokin'. He's too sensible and steady and perspicuous, and uncommon set on me and the child all the while. There's no better son in Ireland. Och, but the rest of them mean no harm wid it. They're just schemin' to drop in presently and be risin' a laugh on me." Steps which were promptly taken to verify old Joe Patman's strange story proved it to be correct in every particular. The only fresh fact which investigations brought to light was the presence of a 5-shilling piece lying on the dresser, where Joe had overlooked it in the early dusk. All the other inmates, chickens and cat included, had disappeared, and with them most of the few movables, the old man and the sick child being left as forlorn fixtures. Lisconnel at large was neither slow nor circumlocutory in forming and expressing its opinion as touching the nature of the joke, a firm belief in which old Joe resolutely opposed to his troubles as they thickened around him. For no tidings came from the absentees, nor were any heard of them, while Katty's fever ran so high that it seemed likely her grandfather would be at small further charges on her account, a prospect which, however financially sound for a capitalist of 5 shillings or under, none the less filled his soul with grief. Then one night, when Katty was at her worst, a great gale came rushing and roaring across the bog, and when the day broke it discovered the Patmans' brown thatched slope interrupted by a gaping crevasse, over which a quick plashing rain sheet quivered. The widow M'Gurk had less spare room than heretofore at her disposal, now that she harboured a co-tenant with a slight accession of tables and chairs. Yet she made out a dry corner for the child and her grandfather, who accepted these quarters in preference to any others, because the widow, whatever may have been her private views, was prevented by a mixture of contrariness and magnanimity from joining in the general denunciation of her former allies, compromising as were the circumstances under which they had elected to take their departure. In her society, therefore, he was not obliged to overhear trenchant criticisms upon his Tom's behaviour, and could dilate, at least uncontradicted, upon those gifts and graces in the young man, which recent events had certainly placed in some need of exposition. Other disquieting voices there were, however, which he could not dodge, and they spoke louder every day. For his 5 shillings were melting, dwindling, had vanished, and Lisconnel, with the best will in the world, could ill brook a burden of 2 incapables more laid upon its winter penury. No word on the subject had reached the old man's outer ears, but as Katty struggled slowly and fractiously toward convalescence, it became clear in his mind that unless something happened, she must, when well enough to be moved, seek change of air away at the big house. Perhaps this prospect was now more constantly before him than even the thought of Tom's filial virtues, as he sat drearily on the bank by the widow M'Gurk's door. He might often be seen to shake his head despondently, and then he was probably saying to himself, "Belike he thought bad of me, keeping the bit of money unbeknownst." By that time he had abandoned the joke theory, and fixed his hopes upon the arrival of a letter to explain the mysterious nocturnal flitting, and say whither they had betaken themselves after passing through Duffclane, the furthest point to which the detective forces of the district had tracked the party. Young Dan O'Beirne, whose work brought him daily up from down below to the forge a long way on the road toward Lisconnel, had safely promised to convey this letter so far whenever it came, and on many a day the neighbours nodded commiseratingly to one another as they saw the old creature, goodness may pity him, setting off with himself in quest of it. The prompt January dusk would have already fallen before he struggled up the knockawn to be greeted by the widow in the tone of marked congratulation which our friends sometimes adopt when all reason for it is conspicuously absent. "Well, man alive, there wouldn't be e'er a letter in it this day anyway." "Och, to be sure, not at all," he would answer cheerfully. "I wouldn't look to there bein' e'er a one sooner than to morra. I hadn't the notion of expectin' a letter whatever. 'Twas just for the enjoyment of the bit of a walk I went." "Why, to be sure it was. But be comin' in, man, for you're fit to drop and be gettin' your ould brogues dried. Och, man, you're drowned entirely. 'Tis a mighty soft evenin' it's turnin' out." "And here's Katty lookin' out for you this great while," Big Anne would say. "She's finely this evenin', glory be to goodness." CHAPTER XIII. A return. Affairs were much in this posture when the widow M'Gurk was one day perplexed by the occurrence of 2 small incidents. In the first place, as she was starting on an expedition to the town, she saw at a little distance something run across the road, which looked uncommonly like the Patmans' black cat Tib. Lisconnel owns no other cats for which she might have mistaken it. Still, as she was puzzled to think how the creature should have hidden itself away for more than a fortnight, she concluded that she had been deceived by some fluttering bird or glancing shadow. In the next place, she happened in the town upon one Larry Donnelly, who in the course of conversation remarked, "So you've that young Patman back wid yous again. What took him to be leggin' off wid himself that way?" "And what put that in your head at all?" said the widow. "Light nor sight we've seen of him, or a one of them, or likely to. It's off out of the country he is belike, and he after robbin' his ould father, that's never done talking foolish about him, and leaving his innocent child to go starving into the Union. Bad luck to him." She found a free expression of her sentiments rather refreshing after the restrictions under which she was placed at home. "Well now," said Donnelly, "I'd a bet me best brogues I seen that chap a couple of nights ago streelin' along the road down about our place, but 'twas darkish enough, and I might aisy be mistook." The widow pondered much over this statement on her homeward way, but had the forbearance to say nothing about it. She was still undecided whether or no she would communicate it to anybody, when next morning, on her way for a can of water, she saw the black cat, unmistakable this time, run across the road, and, as on the day before, make off over the bog towards the little river. Widow M'Gurk stood staring after it for a few minutes, and came to a resolution. Then she looked about her, and was aware of Andy Sheridan's head leaning against his doorpost. Of Andy her opinion was, as we have seen, rather low, but she could descry no other person available for her purpose, so she called to him. "Andy, lad, I'm going after me 2 pullets that strayed on me. Come and be giving me a hand." Andy lounged over to her good naturedly, and they turned into the bog, where Ody Rafferty presently joined them. The widow thought her fowl might be among the broken ground, where the stream runs at the back of the Knockawn, and the three went in that direction. It was a mild, soft, grey morning, and they met with neither stir nor sound, till they came abruptly upon a grassy hollow, shut in by furzy banks and fronted by the running water, and then the widow, who alone had been expecting the unexpected, uttered a surprised screech, and said, "Och, boys dear, goodness gracious guide us." What they saw was the figure of a man in a long grey coat, crouched out of a heap under the bank. Near him were ranged in a row 6 oranges, striking up a wonderful golden glow. A small grimy scrap of paper was spread out near them, covered with several piles of shillings and pennies, and a silver thimble. Beside these, Tabby the cat sat severely tucked up, apparently dissatisfied and irked by the situation. At the widow's exclamation, the man raised his head, and was seen to be Tom Patman, looking haggard and dazed, and as hollow-eyed as little Katty herself. Widow M'Gurk and Ody and Andy stood in a line facing him. "Whither now, Tom Patman?" said Ody, "and what might you be doin' wid yourself?" "I'm sittin' here," said Tom. "Och, musha, tell us somethin' we don't know then. Sittin' there you are, sure enough. But what the mischief are you after, might I politely ax, and what do you mean by it, at all?" "I'm sittin' here," said Tom again, "and starvin' I am, and sittin' and starvin' I'll be more betoken till the ind of me ould life. Sure what else 'ud I be doin', and meself to thank for it, wid never a soul left belongin' me in the mortal world, nor a place to be goin' to?" "Well, to be sure," said Mrs. M'Gurk, "if that talk doesn't beat all that iver I heard." And himself after traipsin' off as permiscus as an old hen that won't sit on her eggs, and leavin' his own flesh and blood behind him as if they were the dust on the road. And then he ups and gives chat about never a soul bein' left him. "'Twas Tishy bad cess to her," said Tom. "Och, but it's the mischievous old divil skins is Tishy M'Crum, and it's herself stirred up Martha, that wouldn't be too bad altogether if she'd be let alone, till the two of them had me tormented wid tellin' me the old man had pots of money he never spent as long as he had us be livin' on, and that we'd all do a deal better if some of us slipped away easy widout raisin' a row, and left him for a bit, while we'd be sellin' Martha's things and singin' about gettin' into a dacint little place, instead of the whole of us to be starvin' alive up at Lisconnel, that's nothin' more than a bog bewitched. And he after lettin' us be sold up, they said, and all the while ownin' mints of money, so that we'd no call to be over particular about leavin' him to make a shift along wid the child, if 'twas a convenience. On'y he'd be risin' a quare whillabaloo if he knew we were goin' off anywheres. Troth, I couldn't tell you all the gabbin' they had day and night, and showin' me the place he kep' his bag hidden in, and this way and that way. Och, bedad, themselves persuade the hair on your head it grew wrong side out, if they'd a mind to it." "They might so," said Ody, "supposin' I was great gomerel enough to be mindin' a word they'd say, or the likes of them." In his subsequent reports of the interview, Ody always alleged that he had replied, "Aye, very belike supposin' it grew on the head of an ass," which was certainly neater. But Ody Rafferty's repartees, like those of other people, are occasionally belated in this way. "So the ind of it was," Tom went on, "nothin' else 'ud suit them except gettin' all readied up for us to be slinkin' out in the evenin' late. Faith, I'd 20 minds in me heart agin quittin' little Katty, and she that bad. Howanever, they swore black and white that me father'd be spendin' all manner of money on her when he got us out of it, and we were to be writin' for them to come after us as soon as we were settled and everything agreeable, so I went along. But if I did, ma'am, sure when they'd got the bits of furniture sold, the only notion they had was to be settin' off to make fortins in the States, and ne'er a word about Katty and the old man. Och, they had me distracted. Outrageous they were. And that old thief of the world, Tishy, allowerin' me sorra a penny, so as I mightn't ha' been bound to stop wherever they was. But one day they thought they had me asleep in the room corner, and the two of them was colloguin' away at the table, so all of a suddint Tishy whips out me poor father's bag, that I knew the look of right well, when he used to keep his baccy in it, and down she slaps it, and it jinglin' with money. 'What's that for you?' says she. And 'The laws bless her,' says Martha, 'is it after takin' that you are? And what's to become of them cratures up at Lisconnel?' 'Och, blather,' says Tishy, 'you needn't be lettin' on you didn't well know all this while I had it. Sure the old one might ha' had plenty more hidden away on us. Anyway, I left them somethin' to get along wid,' says she. "'The 5 shillin's,' said the widow. 'Och, but that one's a caution.' "'Real hard workin' and industrious she is,' observed Andy. Tom resumed his narrative. "'Them two'll do as well inside as out,' says Tishy. 'I'll just be countin' the bit of silver,' says she. But bedad, I was fairly past me patience, and up I leaps and grabs a hould of the little bag. Och, it's a quare fright I gave them that time, and they not thinkin' I was mindin', real terrified they were," said Tom, sitting up more erect and recalling this rare experience with evident complacency. "And leave that, you omadhawn," said Tishy, with the look of a devil on her. "What foolery are you at now?" "You thievin' miscreant," says I to her, "it's shankin' off to the police I'll be, and layin' a heavy charge agin you for robbin' and stealin', and you after leavin' the innocent child there and the old man to starve without a penny to their names," says I. "Faugh," says she, "for that matter the fever's liker to have took her off again now, wid no trouble to be starvin', and maybe a good job too for everybody. And be this and be that," says I, "if I thought there was e'er a fear of it, 'tis wringin' your ugly neck round I'd be this instant. Let go of the bag," says she, sweeping up some of the shillin's that was spilt. "The police," says I, "and a heavy charge if there's another word out of your hijeous head." "I vow and declare," says Martha, "I believe 'twould be the cheapest thing we could do wid him, to let him take it and go. Sure he'd be divil a hap'orth more use for an immigrant than the old cat there I was ape enough to bring along to pacify the childer." So then Tishy gave some more impudence, but the last ind of it was we come to an agreement that I'd take the note and the silver, and they'd keep what bits of gould was in it, and they'd go off wid themselves wherever they pleased at all, and I'd tramp straight back here to be lookin' after the child and the old man. Ay, bedad, we settled it up civil enough, and afore I went, Martha handed me the old thimble and bid me bring it to Katty. 'Twas her mother's,' sez she, 'I was keepin' for her, and thick it is wid holes be the same token, but don't say I'd be robbin' it off of her. And they tould me to take Tib along, or else they'd be lavin' her to run wild. So I put her in the basket. Begorra, I believe Bobby had a notion to be comin' wid me and the cat, for he was lettin' sorrowful bawls the last thing I heard of him. So away I come wid the best of me haste. Och, I knocked the quare walkin' out of meself entirely, and I stopped at the last big place I was passin' to get Katty the oranges, and I was trampin' it all the night after, till just when there was a streak of the mornin' over the bog, I come into Lisconnel. But, och, wirra, the roof's off of the house, och, the look of the black hole wid the rafters stickin' through it, and ne'er a breath of smoke, till me heart was sick watchin' to see might there be an odd one, and the door clappin'. Sure be that I well knew the child was dead, me father quit out of it, or maybe buried himself, and I after leavin' them dyin' and starvin'. So, for 'fraid somebody be comin' out and tellin' me, off I run away into the bog, till I was treadin' here in the cold water, and then I tumbled the old cat out of the basket that was scrawlin' and yowlin' disp'rit, and I took and slung the basket into the stream. There's the handle among them rushes, and down I sat under the bank. I dunno how many nights and days it is at all, but here I stop. Never a foot I'll stir to be lookin' for bite or sup, or lettin' on I'm in it, and anybody may take the bit of money and welcome. I'd as lief be pickin' up the dirt on the road, for I'll just give me life a chance to ind out of the world's misery and desolation." "Now may goodness forgive you," said the widow M'Gurk. "It's a poor case to want the wit. Troth, and yourself's the quare old child desertin' mean-spirited, easy-frighted slieveen of a young bosthoon. But what sort of contrivance is it you have on you at all, be way of a head that you couldn't have the sense to consider the roof blowin' off a body's house would be the reason enough for them to be quittin' out of it, and no signs of dyin' in the matter? Do you think the wind was apt to be waitin' till there happened to be nobody widin, afore it got scatterin' the thatch? God help us all, you've little to do to be squattin' there talkin' about desolations and miseries, with the two of them this instant minute sittin' be the fire up at my place, and sorra a hand's turned ailin' 'em, for by Katty's a trifle contrary now and then, through not bein' entirely strong yet." And bedad, at that hearin', reports of the occurrence used to proceed from this point, the leap he gathered himself up wid, and the rate he legged it off musha he was over the hill while we were pickin' up his things for him. And as for the old cat that he tripped over, it rolled 3 perch of ground before it got a hold of its 4 feet. Sure we were sittin' there as quite as could be conceived. The conclusion of this precipitate rush was thus recounted, when all of a suddint we couldn't tell what come bouncin' in at the door, as if it had been shot out of the ends of the earth, and had us all jumpin' up and screechin', till we seen it was only Tom Patman, and he in such a takin' you might suppose he thought somethin' 'ud swallow up old Joe and the child on him before he could get at them. Lisconnel's opinion was divided as to whether Tom would actually have stayed and starved in his hiding place had he not been discovered. Mrs. M'Gurk thought it likely enough. The cat goin' back and forwards that way, she said, give her an idea there was somethin' amiss in it, and that was why she took Andy along. 'Deed, and she got a quare turn when first she spied the chap crouchin' under the bank. She couldn't tell but he might have been a corp. Brian Kilfoyle's view was, devil a much, sure if he'd had e'er a notion to be doin' anything agin himself, there was plenty of deep bog holes handy for him to sling himself into, and have done with it. Whereupon Mrs. Sheridan crossed herself and said deprecatingly, "Ah, sure belike the crathur wouldn't have the wickedness in him to do such a thing. Her husband didn't know, but he might. Them soft sort of fellers 'ud sometimes stick to anything they took into their heads, the same as a dab of mortar agin a wall." And Ody Rafferty supposed The fact of the matter was, that if be any odd chance they got a notion of their own, they mistook it for somebody else's. On one point, however, the neighbours, Mrs. M'Gurk not excepted, were practically unanimous: the utter flagitiousness, namely, of Tishy M'Crum. There was a tendency to begrudge her the trivial merit of having voluntarily left behind her the 5-shilling piece, for this marred the perfect symmetry of iniquity which is so pleasant to the eye when displayed by people of whom we have no opinion. Only Mrs. Brian said it was a mercy she had that much good nature in her itself. But even she added that the fewer of them kind of folk she saw comin' about the place, the better she'd be pleased, and she hoped they'd got shut of them for good and all. This aspiration seemed the more likely to be fulfilled when within a week or so the Patmans heard from the family of Tom's first wife, who held out prospects of work for himself and a home for Katty and his father, a proposal which was gladly accepted. Their departure left as the single trace of their sojourn to Lisconnel Tib the cat, which remained behind, a somewhat unwelcome bequest to the widow M'Gurk. Indeed, I fear the creature became a source of some annoyance to her, because Andy Sheridan contracted the habit of addressing it by the name of Tishy, and bestowing upon it the same laudatory epithets with which the widow had been wont to justify her admiration for the energetic sisters. It was on a hushed February morning that the Patmans finally departed. The smell of spring was in the air, and filmy silvery mist had begun to float off the dark bogland in vanishing wreaths, soft and dim as the frail sloe blossom, already stolen out over the writhen black branches up on the ridge. A jewel had been left in the heart of every groundling trefoil and clover leaf, and the long rays that twinkled to them were still just tinged with rose. Here and there a flake of gold seemed to have lit upon the clump of sombre green furze bushes, by which neighbours in a small knot stood watching the 3 generations of Patmans dwindle away down the road with its narrow dewy grass border, threading the vast sweep of sky-rimmed brown. Father and son walked, while little Katty bobbed along, balanced in a swaying donkey pannier. The widow M'Gurk, who felt a good deal of concern about the destiny of her late lodgers, hoped they were going to decent people, for there wasn't as much sense among the 3 of them as you'd put on a 4-penny bit. And Mrs. Quigley thought 'twould be hard to say which the young man or old one was the foolishest, for the blathers old Joe talked about Tom, and the gabby Tom made of himself over the child, now that he had his own way with her, was past belief. "And I can tell you," said Ody Rafferty, "there's folks goin' about that you'll want all the wits you iver had, and maybe a trifle tacked on, to get the better of rightly." "Och, I question will they ever do any great things, goodness help 'em," said Mrs. Sheridan. "'Twill be much if he keeps them outside the house." "Well, anyway," said Biddy Ryan, "I'd liefer be in their coats, for fortin or no fortin, than like them 2 ugly tempered women settin' off to the dear knows where, after robbin' and plunderin' all before them." "Thrue for you then, Biddy," said Mrs. Brian, turning away from her wide outlook. "We're none so badly off, when we're stoppin' where we are instead of streelin' about with the notion of such black villanies in our mind. For sure enough," she said, as she faced round towards the grey peaked end walls and smoke plumed thatch of Lisconnel, "the world's a quare place to get travellin' through, take it as you will." Chapter 14. Good luck. Although Laraghmena is no great distance from Lisconnel as the crow flies, but little intercourse takes place between the 2 hamlets. For the crow's flight would be over a rugged mountain ridge, sinking into a trackless expanse of bog, which often spreads rough and wet walking before wayfarers who have to experience it at closer quarters than those who merely throw down a flapping shadow as they pass. And round by the road is a good long tramp, not to be lightly undertaken. So it does not happen half a dozen times in the year, perhaps, that anybody comes from thence to Lisconnel, and our visits thither are fewer still. The neighbours say that the people up there do be very poor entirely, and are wont to use a commiserating tone when speaking of them. But their knowledge of the locality and its inhabitants is by no means intimate, and would be even less so, were it not that Teresa Joyce and her brother Mick, the remnant of Mrs. Kilfoyle's family, are now living there, which makes a connecting link. Laraghmena is scattered rather wildly over the slopes of a grey mountain that shoulders the sea at the point where its foam comes nearest to Lisconnel. Some of the cabins stand so low along the shore that the shingle knocks clattering at their doors when the tide is full and rough, and some are perched so high up on the hillside that they constantly disappear from view behind a curtain of the pale mists which haunt its summit, creeping to and fro. When one of these little white dwellings, with its field fleck beside it, emerges from the clouds, you feel as if the slightly improbable had happened, since at such a height you would have expected nothing but the appropriate rocks and swampy patches. There was once a French princess who would no doubt have wondered why on earth any people should choose to live and farm in such unchancy places. Rather than that, she would have ploughed herself up a little bit of the rich green land which spreads its broad tracks round about, with sometimes sheep nibbling over it, and here and there a few deer. But the views of this young lady are represented as having been so far in advance of her age that she seems hardly possible as an historical personage, and withdraws into the myth-mists. To that region certainly belongs the ancient chronicle in which we read how the Irish Nemedians, revolting against the intolerable deal of cream and butter and wheaten meal exacted from them by their oppressors, the Fomorians, those ferocious African pirates, emigrated to Hellas in hope of better things, but were at last driven back home to escape the heavier yoke of the Athenians, who compelled them to dig clay in the valleys and carry it in leathern bags to the top of the highest mountains and the most craggy rocks, in order to form a soil upon those barren places and make them fruitful and able to bear corn. That history should repeat itself is, of course, to be recognized as merely a commonplace fact, but a myth reproducing itself in the shape of events happening visibly before our eyes is a rarer phenomenon, and it seems to be occurring whenever a string of Laraghmenians come plodding up their winding mountain path under the burden of heavy creels filled with earth, or oftener with slippery brown sea-wrack and leathery weed. For it is in this way that whatever scanty foothold their starveling crops may find has been fashioned and maintained in the stony little fields. Year by year, as the blustery days of late autumn darken into winter, the steep-ledged path is wetted all along with sea water, and bestrewn with dark trails and tough tawny pods out of the dripping creels, until it grows as sharply ocean-odorous as the beach, while the many bare feet are continually toiling slowly up and quickly pattering down it. Yet their efforts are rewarded by only meagre and stunted growths, so intractable is the material upon which they are expended. Mickey Joyce has been heard to declare, as he took a despondent bird's-eye view of his holding, that you might as well be trying to raise crops in the crevices of the stone walls. However, as we were just now shown, These dwellers at Laraghmena have another resource to fall back upon. In fact, they have nothing less than the wide sea as a supplement to their bit of land. The queer small boats hauled up on the sand and dark brown net festooning the rafters betoken that, as does also the bit of salt fish hung against the wall, pallid and juiceless, a shadowy wraith-like looking viand. But the bounty of the sea has limits. It does not yield up its stores for nothing, but takes as well as gives, and it helps itself sometimes on a liberal scale. Some years ago, for instance, it took poor Thady Joyce and several of his companions, who had gone off in a couple of luggers after the herrings. The event is remembered with awe at Laraghmena, because in that wild March gloaming Con the Queer One had met Thady himself face to face, stepping up the winding path, and had given him good evening, and asked him how he had got all dripping wet, just at the very time when the unlucky lad must have been lying drowned miles and miles from there, among the surges of Galway Bay. Other such toll has often been levied since then, for the curraghs and pookawns in which Laraghmena goes to sea are frail craft to cope with the billows come rolling, maybe, from the fog banks of Newfoundland, and blasts that have cooled their breath among hills of ice before they sweep across the Atlantic. Now and then a boat comes to grief even in the short voyage made for the purpose of cutting wrack from the shells of the black reef that lies a bit off the shore. So, on the whole, the inhabitants of Laraghmena may be considered to pay dearly for their supplies of fish and seaweed. And we at Lisconnel, though we lived beyond reach of such things, and have few substitutes for them, are not far wrong in speaking of the people up there as real poor entirely. Yet they themselves would not by any means have it supposed that they think bad, as they call it, of their fortunes and habitation. On the contrary, whatever their private opinion may be, they are disposed to uphold the merits of the place in public, and to prove themselves sudden and quick in resentment of any outsider's disparaging criticism. The most deadly insult that can be offered to a Laraghmenian as such is an allusion to the libellous report that has somehow become current to the effect that his reverence at Drumroe, the nearest parish, always sends out a special messenger on Saturday night to remind them of the morrow's mass, the innuendo being that Laraghmena's out-of-the-way situation and general want of culture preclude its inhabitants from knowing the day of the week. This is why an innocent seeming remark such as, "Well, boys, it's Tuesday this morning," has been known to set blackthorns whirling wildly. Something of the sort occurred at Sallinmore Fair one day in last September, when Matt Doyne and Andy Sheridan from Lisconnel fell in with their acquaintances, Larry Sullivan and Felix Morrow from Laraghmena. After they had fought as long as seemed good to them, they exchanged what news they had. The most important piece was that Larry and Felix were presently setting off to the States. They were rather urgent in advising the other two lads to join their party, but Andy said that everything would go to sticks at home if he was out of it, and Matt averred that his mother would be of the opinion she was lost and kilt entirely if he so much as mentioned any such an idea. "And herself with your brother Terence at home to be keeping her company," objected Felix. "Sure there's me mother, wid ne'er another creature in the world, you may say, but meself, and she's never done this last 6 months persuadin' me to go along." "Then it's the queer woman she must be, bedad," said Matt, "unless it's yourself the queer bosthoon on her entirely, and maybe that's like her," a rejoinder which brought on a renewal of hostilities. Just at this time a spell of fine weather, very bright and serene, had been brooding over Lisconnel. It was the early spring of autumn, when leaves and berries here and there are taking a blossom-like vividness. The frost-touched briar sprays seemed to have found and dipped in the same red that had dyed the young buds and shoots of April. The air was so still that the seeded dandelions stood day after day with their fairy globes unbereft of a single downy dart, like little puffs of vapour among the grasses. A soft mist rounded off all the bogland, holding in a drowse the sunbeams that steeped it, and letting them waken to their full golden glory at the very heart of noon. But one morning the haze began to thicken and darken on the horizon, as if wafts of murky smoke were blown through it, and towards evening massy shapes of black clouds came slowly lifting themselves up, some with outlines curved like bosky clumps of wood, some ruggedly ledged and angled like a drift of begrimed icebergs. By sunset the far west was all a sullen gloom, veined with lurid tawny streaks and mottled with deeper stains. Old Peter Sheridan, who is reputed to have a great eye for the weather, turned it forebodingly upon the prospect, and said the sky was the moral for all the world of the back of an old brindled bull, and he'd never known any good come of that manner of appearance. And true for him. Before sunrise next morning Lisconnel was roused by the revelry of a crashing thunder peal, which preluded a violent storm. It is seldom that one booms and rattles so loudly over our bogland, or glares with so fierce a flame. Brian Kilfoyle, taking a rapid observation through his door, said, "Be the powers of smoke, I never seen the equal of that. You might think they was after whitewashin' the whole place wid blindin' fire. Here's out of it, says I." And he retreated, blinking, to his dark corner. At the height of it, even Auntie Sheridan, who is probably our freest thinker, felt secretly relieved to know that his stepmother and his sisters were saying their prayers. The arrangement seemed to give him a sense of security, without claiming any concessions from his superior strength of mind. But in the end the perilous clouds rolled away, growling and gleaming towards the mountains and the sea, leaving only one victim behind, the Quigley's little goat, who had been struck dead by a lightning flash, to the sorrow of her owners, and the awe of all Lisconnel, in contemplation of the black and white body stretched out still on her wide grazing ground. The storm, however, seemed to have broken up the fair weather, and the days that followed were blustery and rainy. On the next of them Larry Sullivan and Felix Morrough were seen passing through Lisconnel, evidently equipped for a journey. Larry, who had parted from no near friends, was apparently in good spirits, but Felix looked so much cast down that his contemporaries refrained from any references to the days of the week, and the pair went on their way unmolested amongst the lengthening shadows. They reported the storm to have been terrific altogether up at Larigmena. The Widdy Bourke's thatch was set in a blaze, and it was a living miracle that the whole of them wasn't frizzled up like a pan of fryin' herrins. It may have been 10 days or so after this that a good many of the neighbours had dropped in one evening at Mrs. Doyne's. She had been ailing of late, and old Dan O'Beirne had stepped up from the forge to prescribe for her, and cheer her with accounts of how finely young Dan and her daughter Stacey were getting on at their place down below in Duffclane. The rest of the party had assembled merely for company and conversation. It included members of nearly all our families, Kilfoyles and Quigleys, and Ryans and Raffertys, and the Widdy M'Gurk and Big Ann. Presently Judy Ryan, who was looking out of the door, had an announcement to make. "Whether now, and who might yous be when you're at home? There's two women comin' along the road from Sallinbeg ways. I dunno the looks of at all, I should say, but the rain's mistin' thick between me and them. Carryin' bundles they are. If they're not any of the Tinkers, we're right enough. One of them's a little ould body, and the other's a good size bigger. Strangers they are. Och, mercy on me, have I eyes in me head at all? How strange she is. Sure it's Theresa Joyce herself. But we haven't seen her this great while, and who she has along with her I couldn't be telling you. A feeble sort of creature she looks to be, according to the way she's foosterin' along." When these two travellers arrived at the Doynes' door, nobody failed to recognise Theresa Joyce, notwithstanding the estrangement of a long absence, and she hastened to introduce her unknown companion, who kept a tight clutch on her arm, as if afraid to let go, and looked at nobody's face, but seemed to listen from one to the other. She was, it appeared, the widow Morrough from Laraghmena, who had been struck blind by the lightning in the great storm Friday was a week, the sight of her eyes clean destroyed with one flash, as she was throwing a bit of food to the fowl at her door, and the last child she had belonging to her set off the next morning to the States, and now she herself was going to the Union down at Moynalone, for what else could she be doing that couldn't see her hand before her face? So Theresa was bringing her down, and they thought they might have gone as far as Duffclane against night, but the creature wasn't well used yet to walking in the dark, so they were slow coming, and they'd hardly do it. Such was the outline of Mrs. Morrough's history up to date, and its rehearsal had at once the effect of arousing a sympathetic bustle about her, which did not subside until she sat a wet and wayworn guest in the most comfortable hearth corner, and had been provided with a cup of the tea that Mrs. Doyne had made herself in her character of an invalid. She now sat on one side of the blind woman and stirred her tea for her, and on the other Dan O'Beirne shook his head in regretful confirmation of the opinion pronounced by the Drumroe doctor, which was reported to be that mortal man couldn't do her a thraneen of good. Meanwhile Theresa Joyce, who was likewise bedrenched and weary, found a seat in the opposite corner, where her nearest neighbours were Ody Rafferty and her niece-in-law, Mrs. Brian Kilfoyle, with her daughter Rose. "Well, Theresa, it's the long while since you've stepped over to see us," Ody said, starting the conversation, "and it's the soft evening you've chose to be comin'. Your shawl's dreeped. Take it off, and I'll give it a shake above the fire. Bedad, Theresa, the two of us has been wearin' the dusty meal bags on our heads since the time I seen you first. As black as a sloe you was, but now it's liker the blossom it's turned." "And time for it," said Theresa. "Sure I'm over 70 year of age now, anyway, every day of it, and the long days there was among them, God knows." "But wid all that, ne'er a one of them was long enough for you to be findin' a man to your mind in it," said Ody. "And I declare to goodness, I dunno but maybe it's the very sensible woman you were for that same. Sure meself was a great while afore ever I thought of axin' Biddy, and for anything I can tell I might ha' done better if I'd held me tongue a bit longer, and then said nothin', as the sayin' is. I was old enough to know me own mind anyway, but musha for that matter, Rose there'll presently be settin' up to think she's old enough to know hers, and it's 20 chances if she has as much wit as you." "And why would she," said Theresa, "or anybody, be wishin' it to her? Oh, let that alone. There's a deal of different sort of wit, and no reason why one of them shouldn't be as good as another. Look at her grandmother, me sister Bessie. It's plenty of peace and comfort she had with her marryin'." This was quite true, as although she had been rather early widowed, and her only daughter had married an emigrant, her son and his wife had taken such care of her and made so much of her that the neighbours had never thought of calling her the Widdy, a title reserved for a woman left struggling alone, and she had remained Mrs. Kilfoyle to the end of her days. "And look at the poor creature there, what she's come to," said Ody, instancing the tragical figure of the widow Morrough. "Eh, the saints may pity her," said Theresa, "but the likes of such bad luck happens few people, married or single, thank God." "It's a quare unnatural young villain her son must be," said Mrs. Brian, "to skite off and leave her that a way. Sorra the bit he can be good for." "'Deed now, Norah woman, that's the very notion is distressin' me," said Theresa. "For I dunno but it's after usin' him ill, I am. You see the way of it was the poor soul, poor Mrs. Morrough, had the great dread of the say upon her, be raison of her husband and her father gettin' drowned at the fishin'. So she's always the fear in her mind of the same thing happenin' her couple of boys. Howanever, the eldest of them went off to California a good few years back, and was doin' pretty middlin' well out there the last she heard of him, but that's a long while ago now. About gettin' married he was. But Felix, the lad she had at home wid her until the other day, often enough he was bound to be on the water after the fish and the seaweed, if he was to get his livin' at all. And distracted she was, seemin' him goin' out in their ould boat that leaks enough in her to sink the biggest ship ever set sail, and herself with scarce the width to hold a sizable flounder. Says I to Felix one wild evenin', when we was argufyin' wid him, that sure the little loadin' he could be puttin' in her would never be worth losin' his life for. But says he to me, the bit of food they'd put in their mouths was littler again, yet they might be losin' their lives for want of it, and ne'er a word had I said to that. But one night last winter he was as nearly lost as anything in a squall, and after that his mother would be tormentin' herself worse than she was before. So she set her heart entirely on gettin' him to take off to the States, and be out of the way of fishin' and drownin'. She'd ha' gone wid him herself, only they said she was too old, and spoilin' his chances she'd be. A long while it was before he'd hear any talk of it. The whole summer she was persuadin' him, but at last he made up his mind he would. 'Twas no notion of his own to be lavin' her, I'll say that for him. Whether now, but that was as curious a plan as ever I heard tell of for keepin' a person from drownin'," said Ody. "To be sendin' him off over the rollin' seas, sailin' goodness can tell you how many hundreds and thousands of miles. What was she dhramin' of at all, to do such a thing?" "Ah, but sure it's a diff'rint sort of sailin'," said Theresa. "Why, they say one of them big steamers 'ud carry a couple of our little boats along wid her, and you'd scarce notice she had them on board. Terrible safe they must be if they're that size." "And more be token," said Mrs. Brian, "there's such a sight of ships comin' and goin' between this and the States, wouldn't you think that agin now they'd have got a kind of track line crossin' over, as if it was a manner of road they was followin', that nothin's apt to happen them on, and not strayin' about promiscuous in the storms?" "Track?" said Ody shrilly. "Bedad, then it's the quare track, and the quare places it brings them into. Do you know that, for one thing, they go slap through the Bay of Biscay?" "And is that an ugly bay?" said Mrs. Brian. "You can call it that. I wouldn't be sayin' so to herself over there," said Ody, with much careful mystery, "for it might be only discouragin' the crathur worse than she is already. But it's the place where the seven oceans of the world meet. Ay, indeed, ma'am, but don't be lettin' on to her. I was spakin' to a man who had a brother went through it, and he said the ragin' and tearin' of them all flowin' together would terrify the sinses out of King Solomon. They had the great big steamer he was in whirlin' round and round and round, the same as if it was afloat on one of its own paddle wheels, he couldn't tell how many days and nights. Tracks, how are you? It's a very ready one there is in it to the bottom of the say." "Still a good few people gets through it safe enough," said Theresa. "Ay, and comes back through it of an odd while." "But how many's lost in it that you never hear tell of?" said Ody. "Besides that, the man I was talkin' to told me his brother was never right in his head after the tossin' he got. It's a poor case to be landin' ravin' mad in a strange country, supposin' you get there itself. But me own notion is that if people's well off, they'd a right to stop where they are, and if they're misfort'nit, they've a chance anyway of better bad luck stayin' at home." Ody stated his own notion authoritatively, and Theresa looked depressed by the dilemma in which it seemed to place the emigrant. "'Deed now, maybe it's a bad turn I'm after doin' the two of them," she said. "But poor Mrs. Morrough, many a time she says to me it 'ud be the greatest comfort to her at all to get quit of the fear she was in continual whenever he went out wid the ould boat. Sure she might be a bit lonesome, she'd say, but after all what great company was he to her when half the time she would be drownin' him under the roll of the sea like his poor father and grandfather. And wid the most he could do, it's hard set he was to make what 'ud keep him. So she'd planned she'd be able to contrive well enough wid her hens and her spriggin' work till Felix could be sendin' her over a trifle. A very cliver woman she was at the spriggin'. A handkerchief corners she'd work was rael elegant. Pence a piece she got for them, and I've known her finish a dozen in 3 days. Och, but I got a turn on the Friday mornin' when I stepped down to her place to see what way they were after the storm, and there she was sittin' crouched up in a corner and screechin' to me to know who was comin' in, and I standin' before her eyes in the middle of the sunbeam. And glory be to God, says she, that it's yourself, for you'll have the same sinse to give me a hand wid endeavourin' to keep the knowledge of what's after happenin' me from Felix, the way he won't be prevented of goin' to morrow. Sorra a fut would he if he knew aught ailed me, and then sure he might stay at home for good and all, and drowned he'd be, and meself a go deminted. And sure I thought it maybe no thing to be doin', and so I said to her. But it seemed that the heart of her was to be broke altogether if anything 'ud hinder him gettin' out of it. And then I was mindin' the father and grandfather of him, the way they went, and me brother, poor Thady, and I couldn't tell but I might ha' reason to think bad of biddin' him stay. And if he did, sure perhaps he couldn't be keepin' her at all, and she so helpless. It's better able he might be to help her out in the States. And sorra I ha' been to disappoint the crathur of the first wish she'd took a thought of sittin' in the dark of her misfortin'. So the ind of it was I settled I'd stop wid her for the day, and try could we let on there was nothin' amiss when the Felix come in, that was out somewhere since early in the mornin' before the storm began." Section 9